Well, chapter 6 is the shortest chapter in the book of Acts, and chapter 7 is the longest. 6 kind of gives us an introduction to what's going to happen, and then we have this long speech in chapter 7. And again, we're not going to take the speech verse by verse. We're going to take it more theme by theme, and I think you'll understand why as we move our way through it. Now, the interrogation, of course, takes place in the Sanhedrin, and Peter and John have been here before, and this is Stephen's first and only trip here. The results of this meeting will be quite different than the results of the meeting when Peter and John were called before the Sanhedrin. And again, notice that we're meeting here in a little tiny section of the court of the priests in the temple. You can see the tiny little orange dot there on the left side of the building there on that little drawing. All right, so why does the speech happen here? Well, I believe that Stephen's speech, at least in part, serves as a conclusion of the Jewish priority in the early church. Once you get into chapter 8, you find yourself in Samaria with Philip, and then the gospel continues moving out of Jerusalem and to the other parts of the empire. That doesn't mean that the church in Jerusalem ceases to exist or that it diminishes. It just means that the spread of the gospel is Luke's priority in writing. And so chapter 7 with Stephen's speech kind of wraps up what happens, and it illustrates the ongoing persistent rejection of the gospel of Christ on the part of the Sanhedrin, who represent the Jewish people in general. Because the outcome of this speech, as you probably already know, is going to be Stephen's death, and it really points up the continued hard-heartedness of the Jewish people with regard to their Messiah. All right? Now, is Stephen's speech actually a defense or more of an accusation? Well, there is a type of rhetoric that's called legal contention that you find in narrative form. And what that does is it actually brings up a specific legal issue and is formed as almost as an accusation against those. So what happens here in Stephen's speech is that the Sanhedrin is accusing him and interrogating him, but in the midst of his speech, he actually turns the tables on them, and he ends up becoming the accuser and interrogator against the Sanhedrin. And that's one of the reasons, of course, they're going to get so angry with him and decide that he needs to go. All right. You could debate the main purpose of Stephen's speech, but I'm going to state it to you this way. Near the end, you're going to really find the main idea of what Stephen is trying to accomplish in this speech. He's going to call them stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. He's going to accuse them of resisting the Holy Spirit. And then this phrase, as your fathers did, so do you. And really, I think that's the essence of where he's going in his speech. He wants the Sanhedrin to understand that they have not learned anything after all of the Old Testament history that's been recorded. Just as their forefathers, their predecessors, rejected the message of the prophets, turned their back on God, so have they done the same thing. And you're going to see that come through very, very clearly in the speech. And of course, they're not going to be happy with that, and they're going to end up turning on him. So the high priest begins by asking him, are these things so? And again, the high priest is Caiaphas, still serving. And he's basically giving Stephen an opportunity now to present his case. Now, again, there are three main accusations leveled against Stephen. He's speaking against God, and that he's spoken against the law of Moses and against the temple itself. And the speech is not this neatly packaged. It's not like it's all about God in verses 1 through 19 and all about the law in 20 through 43 and so on. But in general, these are three themes that Stephen is going to address as he responds to the question of the high priest, are these things so? He's going to do it from a historical standpoint. He's going to start all the way back with Abraham, the beginning of the Jewish people, and trace the Jewish history to the present. Now, you might ask, do the Sanhedrin members really need a history lesson? Don't they know their own history? Well, of course they do. But when speeches like this were presented, oftentimes they were done so in order for the presenter to highlight certain aspects, certain elements of the Jewish history in order to form the argument that he was making. And that's what Stephen is going to do. He's going to trace the Jewish history from Abraham to the present, and then he's going to extract a certain theme from their history that he wants to make clear to them. There are some sub-themes going on here, some points that he's making, and one of them is that God is not tied to the land of Israel. In fact, when you look at Israel's history, you see that a large portion of it took place outside the land that was promised to them. You see that in the case of Abraham, who lived in Mesopotamia. And as you know, Abraham was a wanderer. He was a sojourner. He never did settle down to a final place because he didn't get the opportunity to dwell on the land as part of a nation. He's the forefather, and you can see references to Mesopotamia, Haran, and then the land where they were dwelling, and then a foreign land, which refers to Egypt. And so again, Stephen is making reference to many Gentile locations, and Luke takes advantage of this, again, to get his readers to think beyond the bounds of Israel. Just as God did things in Israel's past that were not happening in the country itself, so now God is going to do something beyond the geography of Israel in taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Another example, not only Abraham, but Joseph here. Joseph, notice the references to Egypt and Canaan in verse 11, and then verse 16, Shechem. So again, all of this is designed to show that God was active among his people in places other than the land of Israel. And I'm sorry for the small font. Let me make this a little bigger for you here. Here's the case of Moses. And notice that he was in Egypt. He also lived in Midian for a time. Of course, he received his call to go back to Israel on Mount Sinai, and then again back in Egypt. In 36, he's crossing the Red Sea, and they're in the wilderness, and so on and so forth. So Abraham, Joseph, and Moses were all used of God outside the confines of the land of Israel. And then you also have the tabernacle. In its early years, the tabernacle functioned largely outside of the land. It wandered in the wilderness with the people of Israel. And in verse 49, you hear the prophet saying, "Heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool." In other words, God cannot be tied down to a particular land. And I want you to understand, this is no way to diminish the importance of the land that God gave to Israel. It's very important. It's simply to show that God is not bound to the land. And I think part of the reason for Stephen doing this is because the Jews have, at this time in history, kind of developed this idea that this land is it. And if you're not connected here and involved here, you just don't measure up. And it's almost like the land becomes a lucky charm of some sort, and God is obligated to bless the people in this land. And as you know, Jesus has already made it clear to his disciples that that land and their temple and their city is going to be destroyed. And yet this is something that, that was a big deal to them. And then secondly, notice also that Israel experienced times in history when they actually would reject the very person that God had sent to them to deliver them. And that's the case with Joseph. His brothers rejected him. They sold him into the land of Egypt. And yet what happens? He becomes the deliverer of his people from the famine and sure death that would have brought them. And eventually he's reunited with his brothers there at the end of the book of Genesis and so on. So Joseph becomes the deliverer who was rejected by his own brothers. They were envious of him. We've already seen envy on the part of the Sanhedrin when they were going to kill the apostles, and then Gamaliel stood up and rescued them. And you also see Moses as an example of a deliverer who was rejected by his people. And he goes back and recounts this story as well. And when he was trying to come to the aid of his own people, he was accused by them, and they ended up rejecting him and his word, and as a result, they end up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But again, an example of someone who was sent to be a deliverer, who actually was rejected on certain accounts by his own people. And I've highlighted the word congregation there in verse 38 because that's actually the word ecclesia, the word that's used for the church. And I just want you to understand that the book of Acts uses the word ecclesia really to refer to 4 different kinds of groups. Here it's referring to the congregation of Israel in the Old Testament. We do not believe that the church existed in the Old Testament. The church began on the day of Pentecost. But remember that the word ecclesia was a borrowed term that already existed in the Greek world. And Stephen is using it here to refer to the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. This same word will also be used to refer to an angry mob in Ephesus and to places where legal gatherings and trials can be handled, kind of like a courtroom. But we'll talk more about that when we get to those passages. And again, notice that Moses was rejected. There you see it twice in verses 35 and 39. And so Stephen is going to make use of this background information to make his point as he shares his message. And so we're going to call it here. We'll come back and pick it up in verse 2 and see how he moves forward in his presentation.